Hello, my name is Miles Boyce, and for the Teach Me project, I'm going to be going over the cranial bones. Firstly, I'm going to be going over the cranial bones that form the cap of the skull, or the superior portion of the skull. I'm going to teach you the ways of remembering the bones and some major landmarks. Let's start on the frontal bone. This one's pretty obvious since it's the front of your head, aka the frontal. It articulates inferiorly with the parietal bones, or how I remember them is a pair of bones, and you can't say that's not original. And they are connected via the coronal suture. And my memory trick for remembering that is, where does the crown sit during coronation? On the coronal suture landmark. The major landmark of the frontal bone is known as the supraorbital foramen, which, if you know the prefixes and regional names, then you should know what it means. That it is above, supra, the eye cavity, orbital, and of course we know that the foramen is an access point for nutrients to reach other regions. Alrighty, next up is going to be the parietal bones, but as I mentioned before, my technique for remembering them is a pair of bones, like the fruit pear, because they sort of resemble the shape of a pear. These two identical bones make up the most of the superior portion of your cranium, and is the only cranial bone with all four suture articulations. It articulates with the coronal suture in the front, the sagittal suture down the center, and then it articulates the parietal bones together immediately. And I remember that because of the sagittal cut of a body plane is directly down, cutting it into two lateral sides. And then the lambdoid suture, which articulates with the back, and then the squamous suture, which articulates on the lateral side. Now we're going to talk about the bone that forms the posterior, the back side of the cranium. The occipital, like the word occupied, at least that's how I remember it, articulates with the parietal bones via the lambdoid suture. And I remember that because of the Greek letter lambda. There's three landmarks to go over: the occipital condyle, the foramen magnum, the hypoglossal canal. First up, the occipital condyle are two fang-looking structures that sit above the foramen magnum, and this is what articulates the skull to the vertebrae. The foramen magnum is the largest foramina of the body, and I remember the name because of the dumb joke about Magnum condoms. The spinal cord enters through here. It sits on the posterior of the skull, and lastly is the hypoglossal canal. It's going to be directly under the occipital condyles, hence hypo, which means under or below, which could be your biggest hint if you're looking for it. The temporal bone is the last of the exterior cranium and forms the lateral sides of the skull. Starting with the exterior acoustic meatus, which is your outer ear, and I remember because outer, then acoustic, so you think music, and meatus is just a fun word, so I remember it. And this is going to be located on the inferior portion of the temporal bone. Next up is the mastoid process, which is a bump you feel behind your ear, and I remember it because it sounds like asteroids. And that process is a structure that sticks out from the bone, directly inside the wall of the mastoid process. Houses the mastoid air cells, which should be an obvious association. The styloid process sits anteriorly and slightly medial to the mastoid process, and is a single fang-like structure. The best way to remember this is a stylus means pen in Greek. The next structure is the zygomatic process, and for any Pokemon fans, I remember it because of the Pokemon Zygarde, and it is the arch that reaches anteriorly to articulate with the facial bones. The carotid canal sits on the medial portion of the temporal bone, is anteriorly slanted or oblique foramen, just lateral to the foramen magnum. Directly posterior to that is another large foramen, known as the jugular foramen, which is easy to remember since that jugular is a commonly known term. Now it's time for the keystone bone of the skull, which is the sphenoid bone, and articulates with every single cranial bone. This is the one of the two odd-shaped cranial bones, the other being the ethmoid, but that'll be next. Sphenoid bone resembles a bat with its wings spread out and has quite a few landmarks to go over. The first is going to be the Seller Tusiko, which translates to Turkish saddle, and it resembles a bat head and its wings hanging upside down, directly anterior to the foramen magnum. You can't miss it. Next up will be the greater wings, not to be focused with the lesser wings, that are going to be more superior. The greater wings are lateral to the Seller Tusiko and is the fossa looking area. Superior to this is the smaller and sharper lesser wings. To memorize them, just think larger wings are greater and lesser are less. Next up, we have the pterygoid process, which only can be seen inferior of the sphenoid, resembling two downward tunnels cut in half. To help remember the name and spelling, just think of a pterodactyl, the widely known flying dinosaur. Next up, we have the optic canal, and if we know the optic is the eyes, the optic canal is the whole reason we are able to see. It is located superiorly to the Seller Tusiko, and medially to the lesser wings, almost sitting right inside the beginning of the wings. This next part gets a little tricky. The various foramina that sit lateral to the Seller Tusiko. First up will be the foramen rotundum, which quite literally means round. It is a small foramen, posterior and lateral to the Seller Tusiko, under the optic nerve. Posterior to this is the foramen ovale, which means oval and makes this landmark an easy find. It's almost a perfect oval shape. Directly medial to this is the foramen lacerum, which sounds like lacerated, and that foramen is not smooth. It appears to have been slashed. So next time we get asked where it is, just look for the jagged foramen next to the ovale foramen. Lastly, we have the superior orbital fissure, and this is laterally to the foramen rotundum, and is a thin slit under the lesser wings.